What? Did you think we were done with this game? Nope! Welcome back to From Concept to Console, where we're still looking at The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Now, if you missed part 1, I suggest popping back and watching that, otherwise you're going to be a little bit confused this episode. If you have seen part 1, well, you've just seen a trailer, and oh boy, is there a lot to go through. Hyrule is just beginning to take shape, Link's inventory, well, that's evolving like crazy, and the beginnings of a story are just being seen. So I think it's time we dove back into the lost woods of this game and discover what exactly went missing and what exactly began to be created whilst making Ocarina of Time. Right now you can see another trailer for the game in the background. Now we're not going to be looking at this trailer, instead we're going to look at that longer trailer I showed you at the beginning, except this time in true Ocarina of Time fashion we're going to go in slow motion and mess around with time. So, shall we begin? Now aside from the very early logo, the first thing we're going to see is Beta Lon Lon Ranch, and this is the first time we've seen Lon Lon Ranch in the entire beta stage, and it looks different, very different. It's wide and open, not enclosed like in the final version. We don't actually see this model ever again. Now you're looking at the inside of a house. It looks very similar to the final game, except 1, we can use our items, and 2, this entire room is 3D modelled. In the final game, it's just a texture put on the background. Makes you wonder why they didn't keep doing this. I assume it's for cartridge size space. Now welcome to our first appearance of the Great Deku Tree. He looks very, very similar to the one we get in our game, except for the textures. They are a lot more basic. Although the light, you gotta admit, that looks very nice. I kinda wish they kept that in. He has a rather comically red nose, which I don't quite get. Is he ill? I suppose a curse can be considered ill, but other than that, it just doesn't really make any sense. Link is still rocking his beta look, with the brown sleeves and the brown trousers, and to be honest, brown everything else apart from his shield and tunic. In fact, the entire game, don't you think, looks a little bit muddy? Everything's very dark and gungy, I guess, if that's even a word. As you can see in this beta Dugongong's cavern, the first time we've actually seen it in motion. No lava or anything here at the moment, though. Now, next up, we're going to run into the beta Stalfos models again. They look exactly the same as we saw before, but more importantly, we want to look at what Link is about to take out. Now, you may notice he has 2 swords equipped on his inventory. We don't know if he could use them at once, but we do know that one of these swords was the Big Goron sword, clearly put into the game quite early on. It would appear that Link was able to also get the sword early in the game, since he had it whilst he was with the Great Deku Tree. Now, here we see the Dugongos, and their fire and explosions are not all that different to what we see in our version of the game. In fact, they're very, very similar. But whilst we're on the subject of Link's enemies, it's worth pointing out how Navi is now turning red around them. Still no lock-on feature though in this entire video, which seems very odd because that was the only purpose Navi was put into the game for, to be a navigational tool to point towards your enemies. Link just waves his sword around rather aimlessly throughout this entire video. Right, well, welcome back to Dugongong's Cavern, or maybe the Fire Temple, who knows, but more importantly, what is Link fighting? Well guys, these are the Zols, or the Gels, once you split them apart. They're old Zelda enemies set to reappear in Skyward Sword, but they never appeared in Ocarina of Time. It's worthwhile noticing that they look very similar to the Chews from Twilight Princess. Now back to Death Mountain, still looking very similar to the beta screenshots we've already seen when we just had the A and B buttons for the inventory. Not much has really changed here. However, I'm going to talk about what we're going to see next. We're going to go back to Ganon's Castle. There we are. Now, could this be that this was still in the stage when the game was supposed to be set entirely in Ganon's Castle? Much like Mario 64 with Link going to various different worlds. This is incredibly possible because we've seen no Hyrule Field throughout this entire video, but we do know this was intended to be put in early because Miyamoto really wanted to ride a horse around. Finally, let's look at one attack that was taken out of the game. Link spins, flips, and plunges his sword down. Basically the jump attack but fancied up. This actually is in the game, you can get it through hacking.
In fact, there's some other removed moves still in the game as well. Now, we can clearly see that the Great Deku Tree is now in the game along with Navi, so surely some story elements must now be appearing. Well, yes, but still no young Link, but, interestingly, and I should point out, this is just speculation, we do have this render here. Now, where could Link be? There is one possibility. You see, at one point in development history, the Temple of Time was known as the Hall of Time. This looks like a hall, that looks like a pedestal, so maybe this was where the Master Sword was taken from? No time travel element yet, but who knows? As for story, well, that's actually quite similar to what we have now. Link is summoned from the forest by the Great Deku Tree, has been cursed by the evil Lord Ganondorf. Link breaks the curse, but there's still problems out in Hyrule, so he goes off to save the day. There's only about 3 to 5 dungeons in the game at the time, and the Master Sword wasn't got until the final dungeon, which was Ganon's castle, where it would be found in the Hall of Time, to slay him and save the world. Similarly, there wasn't any other races in the game at the time, no Zoras, no Gorons, no Deku Scrubs. And another thing we should point out is the Lost Woods. The Lost Woods were very different, a huge wood that went on for miles, which you could only be guided through by a Poe. Sound a bit familiar? Yes, that's because the concept reappeared in the form of the desert in the final game. Now, we'll get back to the story in a minute, but hang on. This looks really familiar. In fact, it almost looks like our game. But there is one thing you might want to notice. Well, apart from the fact the shield's different, look at that medallion. That's the Forest Medallion. Well, at this point it was the Wind Medallion, but we'll get to that later. Why is it equipped? Well, you see, originally in the game, these would be your magical spells. Remember Din's Fire and things like this? Well, the medallions were the way you would activate them. They were literally items you would use. Link, meanwhile, is still looking pretty beta-ish. He's blonde now, but he's still a bit muddy and murky. But have a look at what he's got equipped, where his sword should be. It's a bow. Now, what's a bow doing there? Well, it was a C button back then. You could equip whatever you wanted there, whether it be bombs or bows or just the sword. However, there's a lot of things in this game at this point that look very similar to our own game. For instance, look, here's the Desert Oasis, and what's up there? Is that an early Megaton hammer? I think it is. Meanwhile, we have Lake Hylia, but more importantly, the first screenshots of Epona, Link's trusty steed. Meanwhile, though, Nintendo were thinking, we haven't got enough dungeons in this game. Let's make it bigger, and this is where we really begin to see our game appear. They scrapped most of the early dungeons. You can only find 2 rooms from the Stalfos dungeon still in the game. Instead, we now see the Fire Temple, and more importantly, meet Gohma. That's right, the model of Gohma was still in this point of the game. They hadn't changed it since. Though when you fought her isn't clear, it wasn't the first dungeon because Link already has a medallion. Actually, while on the subject of medallions, have a look at what the Forest Medallion actually looks like. Now correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to resemble a fan. That's because the Forest Temple was originally the Wind Temple. Part of this actually remains in the form of Ganon's castle, while the Forest Challenge is a Winds Challenge. In similar fashion, the Water Medallion resembles a snowflake, because it originally was the Ice Temple. Part of this remains in the form of the Ice Cavern in the final game, along with some unused objects which would have appeared in this dungeon which you can find through hacking. Not to mention, remember how I said these were used for magic? Well, the Fire Medallion was Din's Fire. Look in your version of the game and see what's on the ground just before the Shadow Temple, the only place where you're required to use Din's Fire. It's the Fire Medallion symbol, showing that you were supposed to use the Fire Medallion at this point. Of course, they removed this later on in the 3DS version, but it remains in the Nintendo 64 version. In fact, these medallion symbols pretty much popped up everywhere, and to an extent, even remain in the final game. For instance, the Medallion of Light originally appeared within the Temple of Time on a pedestal. It's actually still there on the warp platform when you spawn there. Have a closer look. In fact, pedestals nicely link back into the story, because the Ocarina of Time was actually now in the game. Yeah, it took that long for it to appear. Originally, you'd have a pedestal where you play the Ocarina. You could still find this in the game, but if you get near it, the game would just crash unless you have another code to make it lean slightly. In fact, all of the game began to have huge changes around this point, not just the story. Although the Ocarina of Time did play a big role, as did the Sacred Stones which were introduced, along with, finally, young Link. But you see, the Sacred Stones were a bit different because you didn't just collect them to open the door of time. No, you actually inserted them inside the Ocarina, which doesn't make much sense. It would just make the instrument really badly play, but God knows what they were thinking of that. They scrapped it eventually. The temple names also got a bit of a reboot. The Wind Temple, as I said, became the Forest Temple, the Flame Temple, the Fire Temple, the Ice Temple, the Water Temple. We don't know their original names for Shadow or Spirit. They might have been the same. But importantly, the Temple of Light was in the game, the place where people have long since rumoured that the Triforce could be attained. It was there originally, it isn't there now, however. Actually, I'll come clean. I've been dancing around this topic for a while, but I'm gonna have to talk about it eventually. Let's discuss about the whole Triforce rumour that appeared in the game. It's all built up upon these pre-release and beta pictures. Because if you look at the menu, you'll notice the one thing that isn't filled in ever is the Triforce. Everything else gets filling in. It didn't help that people found pictures like this of adult Link with the fairy Ocarina. Now you can't blame them, these beta pictures do look very similar to our final game, but it started all kinds of crazy theories that you get the fairy Ocarina back, you go and defrost Zora's domain, a giant pillar rises up, also from a beta picture, then you jump down and find the unicorn fountain, which doesn't exist. It's an old fairy fountain. It was taken from the game. In fact, there was originally a different Great Fairy as well, one that looked a lot better than these horrific creations that we see now. In fact, you can still find that in the game, not the fountain though. What also didn't help matters was that these were kept in until very late in the game, but it isn't there. You cannot use the unicorn fountain to go to the Temple of Light and find the Triforce. It's not in the game. It's from this point onward that the game really begins to look like our own. The Flame Temple split off into an Adult Link dungeon, the Fire Temple, and a Kid Link dungeon. Dodongo's Cavern was resurrected. The medallions were gotten rid of, the spiritual stones were taken out of the Ocarina, and the story was pretty much being fleshed out. For instance, the Kokiri started appearing again. Here is Saria, although the text boxes are still a little different. There were a lot of minor changes around this point, and that's what we're going to look at from here on out, because there's a ton of them, but they're nothing really big and groundbreaking. There are certainly a lot of photos from this era of rather odd things like Link pulling and pushing and climbing objects, but they do have some quirks to them, like the fact that Link could originally equip the Kokiri sword as an adult, probably a leftover from when this was just an adult Link game. Next up we're going to look at Hyrule Market Town. It originally looked a bit different, there was no Happy Marcel shop, probably meaning it was a late addition to the game. There's also some other minor changes like the lack of plants there. The town's technology was also taken down. It originally featured streetlights within the alleyways and the entrance. The castle itself also had some changes, such as the grass texture surrounding it, which differed a bit from the final version. But probably the biggest change when going into the castle was how you actually entered it. It seems that young Link could initially just walk in and say hello. I'm not kidding, he could literally say hello to the guards and just have a chit chat with them. Bit weird, really. Another change a castle screenshot shows us is that you originally talked to Navi using the B button, unlike the up C in the final game. The Temple of Time also got some changes around this point, such as the fact that the Door of Time at one point looked like a green curtain. The spiritual stones also lost their colour at one point, and the Triforce was upside down. While I'm on this picture, I might as well also point out the fact that Kokiri's sword got a redesign at the late points of the game. For a slightly larger change, remember those 4 gossip stones that block your path in front of the Temple of Time? Well, at some point you could go down the back there and go behind the temple. In fact, the path leading there is still solid in the final product, it just goes to a dead end. Meanwhile, there are several smaller changes to the game that got scrapped, like a sword beam Link originally had. It didn't appear that he needed full hearts to use as like in the original Legend of Zelda. Another thing is that young Link's slingshot was originally yellow and had unlimited ammo, something we also see on the Deku sticks. Meanwhile, the bomb plants are going for some sort of psychedelic design. A lantern at one point was going to appear in the game, as well as some very odd tiny little bird creatures. Interestingly, there were huge trees for the forest at one point, which looked very similar to the trees we see in the opening of Majora's Mask. In fact, many items from the beta of Ocarina reappear in Majora's Mask, such as this bird, which can be seen flying around on the moon, and this treasure chest, which is one of the main treasure chests you're going to use in the final build of Majora's Mask. We'll probably go with Majora's Mask at some point in the future, there's a lot of stuff in that too. Meanwhile, you'll find beta heart containers in the game still, along with this rather quirky sign, which I kind of wish they'd kept in. The Great Deku Tree dungeon also had some revisions, such as one point there was a P randomly written on this door, not sure why. It also had windows, which you don't normally see in trees. There was a pots redesign, at one point we had pots that looked like the ones from A Link to the Past, as well as there being a giant rupee at one point. Naturally, this exploded. What else did you expect it to do? But although if you didn't want giant rupees, there was the smaller alternative, but don't worry, they also caused an explosion. You're going to get hurt either way with money. The developers also liked playing around with the map a lot. We had this geographical style map at one point before a very simple basic looking one, until finally they settled on the one we have in the final game. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about is actually a little bit scary. I'm not even joking, this is kind of creepy. You see, you can find some early character models in the game. And there's a rather weird one, which might have been left in as a joke, but I'm not kidding. Look away from the computer now if you don't want to see Fishlip's eye, lady. Yeah, creepy. Meanwhile, Sheik's eyes were blue at this point in development, unlike the final red, and there were several stone blocks, including a huge, towering, rotating one, that can still be found in the game. Coolest of all, though, is the fact that there's a fully programmed R-Wing from the Star Fox series in there that will act as an enemy and attack you before firing its lasers, doing a barrel roll and exploding in a big burst of flames. Now that we've looked at space travel, let's have a look at horse travel. Yes, horse travel. And let's have a look at Zelda's horse's mane. It's kind of orangey fiery red here, which is different in the final game, but remember that colour, because in this picture here you'll see another horse riding around on Hyrule Field, something which isn't there at all in the final game, but more importantly, it appears to be Zelda's horse, so maybe Sheik would ride with you at some point. The game also had originally a more direct translation, such as in here where Link used to whip Epona to go fast instead of just asking her. Now a cool thing is originally Epona could ride into Hyrule Castle Market Town, the future one destroyed by Ganon, not the one as Kid Link, so obviously you can't ride Epona there. But the coolest of the cool is what happens here. You see this item? This is horse grass. Now this reappears in the Zelda series. This reappears a lot later though, in Twilight Princess, proving that Nintendo keep these concepts in mind, so some of the stuff we see in the beta here may appear in future games. It's almost an exact copy. You play the grass, Epona appears, except in Ocarina of Time, obviously this was replaced by her song. Well guys, that pretty much covers it. There's only two more changes I really need to talk about. The fact they added cutting signs to pieces into the game, at which point Miyamoto exclaimed, "Now that's what I call the Legend of Zelda," and the fact that the sword swapped from the A button to the B button. Other than that, it's basically everything that went into the game. Well, there's a few changes I haven't been able to talk about. Well, maybe more than a few, there is a lot. If you want to find out more, go to the links which I put in the description, including a site which I'm really sad disappeared, but thankfully I found archived. So have a look there and you'll find lots more images and lots more speculation. I basically tried to put it all together. You might also notice though that there's still quite a lot of the beta in our cartridge. Even in the official artwork you can see some of this, like we still oddly have images of Link pulling and pushing things and climbing up stuff, but also look at this one of a chest. That chest is from the beta. It appears in Majora's Mask later, but not in Ocarina of Time. So I hope you enjoyed having a look at what truly made this game a legend and all the stuff that went into it, and next time we'll look at another game. Remember to post your suggestions in the comments below. See you guys next time.